Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Grace Galucci, Executive Director and CEO of NOACA. Welcome to Northeast Ohio's Climate Action Summit. I'm honored to be here today representing NOACA, the Metropolitan Planning Organization for Greater Cleveland. As an MPO, we are responsible for planning the future of our region. NOACA's completion last June of the Long Range Plan ENEO 2050, An Equitable Future for Northeast Ohio, has taught us that to position ourselves as a region of choice, we must be bold in our transportation and environmental planning efforts, particularly as it relates to growth. But we must also be sustainable and resilient to protect the future of our region. This was highlighted in our Vibrant NEO framework as well. Completed in 2015, the plan received the APA's Daniel Burnham Award for Best Comprehensive Plan in the nation. As good as that is, however, it was just a beginning to integrate climate action planning. Vibrant NEO was launched to create a more vibrant, resilient, and sustainable Northeast Ohio, one that is full of energy and enthusiasm, a good steward of its built and natural resources, and adaptable and responsive to change. When people talk about climate change today, we often think of transformative infrastructure investments, providing transportation choices, clean energy technology, and sustainable communities. That's what I think of anyway. They are the ingredients to opportunities for job growth, development, and innovation to help our region thrive. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change finalized the second part of the sixth assessment report, Climate Change 2020 Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability on 27 of February. This report found that human-induced climate change, including more frequent and intense extreme events, has caused widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people beyond natural climate variability. The rise in weather and climate extremes has led to some irreversible impacts as natural and human systems are pushed beyond their ability to adapt. And as bad as it is in Northeast Ohio during the wintertime, this is a totally different scale we are talking about. Across sectors and regions, the most vulnerable people and systems are observed to be disproportionately affected, causing us to reflect on our planning theme of equity. That's why NOACA has dedicated funding, investments, projects, programs, and policies that promote equitable and sustainable approaches to transportation and environmental planning, which means being intentional about the prevention of irreversible climate disruption, especially as it relates to the impact of transportation, again, policies, plans, programs, or projects, or what we refer to as the 4 Ps, as nearly 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions are now attributed to transportation sector. That's right, this is the single largest source. And yes, transportation is now responsible for a larger share than industrial emissions. The urgent need for climate action and the ability to influence it through transportation is precisely why we, as the MPO responsible for transportation planning, are leading this climate action planning process for the region and are convening this summit today, along with our partners from the Cleveland Foundation and the George Gunn Foundation. To our leaders and community representatives joining us today from foundations, governments, business, nonprofit, and other sectors, we must work together to cut greenhouse gas emissions and seek carbon neutrality by 2050. This summit introduces our first kickoff to publicly address stakeholders as a community engagement strategy to ensure a cross-sector of communities and people join NOACA to help develop the region's first climate action plan. Your willingness to participate today begins our commitment as a region to discuss climate action planning that will provide us with cleaner air, improved public health, protection of Lake Erie, and precious freshwater resources, more efficient land use and transportation connections, better management of existing transportation assets, increased access to jobs and housing, and improved socioeconomic status and equity. I believe we are ready to accomplish this together. We have an exciting agenda today with dynamic speakers and panelists to begin this call to action. Thank you again for participating. I would like to now introduce Lake County Commissioner John Hamercheck, President of NOACA's Board of Directors, who will deliver welcome remarks. Commissioner Hamercheck, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you to all of you joining us today. On behalf of NOACA's Board of Directors, we welcome you to the Northeast Ohio Climate Action Summit. Around the country, in the state of Ohio, and throughout our local communities, governments, businesses, and citizens are coming together to confront climate concerns. This summit begins our call to action for the Northeast Ohio region. As Grace mentioned earlier, we're embarking on a bold transportation and environmental planning efforts across our region to build a sustainable future. I believe we're up to the challenge, and we can do better, only if we work together. This means collaborating and building across local municipalities and counties for the betterment of this region. Our perspectives and opinions may differ. However, it's the dialogue and the discussions that help us to build better strategies and solutions. We'll hear today from local and national perspectives, including U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown, U.S. Representative Marcy Kaptur, U.S. Representative Dave Joyce, and from our distinguished list of presenters to explore three key topic areas: a call for climate action, regional partnership, and resiliency. We hope to gain understanding from your respective areas and commitments to climate action in Northeast Ohio. We have a great summit agenda ahead of us today, and we thank all of those participating virtually on the platforms today. Enjoy the summit. We look forward to working together with you on this call to action on climate change. And now back to our director, Grace Galucci.
Thank you again, Commissioner Hamercheck. I now have the honor to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Beth Osborne, who serves as the Director of Transportation for America. We are very appreciative that you've joined us today to speak on getting transportation programs right to impact the climate. Before Beth comes to the platform, I'd like to first note her background and experience. Prior to Transformation for America, Beth was previously at U.S. Department of Transportation, where she served as the Acting Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy and the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy. At DOT, Beth managed the Tiger Discretionary Program, the Secretary's Livability Initiative, the development of the administration's Surface Transportation Authorization Proposal, and the implementation of MAP 21. Before joining DOT, Beth worked for Senator Tom Carpenter as an advisor for transportation, trade, and labor policy. Beth also has served as policy director for Smart Growth America and legislative director for environmental policy at the Southern Governors Association. She began her career in Washington, D.C. in the House of Representatives, working as a legislative assistant for Representative Ron Klink and as a legislative director for Representative Brian Baird. And here she is today with us. Please welcome Beth Osborne.
Thanks so much, Grace. And thank you all for inviting me today. I'm glad to be a part of this important topic and the kickoff. So I actually don't have any slides, so you're just going to have to look at me. This is a product of my being trained and brought up on Capitol Hill where they don't know what PowerPoints are. So I'm just going to talk through some of the challenges we have and some of the opportunities. I know that we have all heard repeatedly that the transportation system makes up 28% of greenhouse gas emissions. But I want to point out that it's the only sector that has growing emissions, or at least had growing emissions until COVID. It's the only sector going in the wrong direction. And if history is any guide, while we have had a brief stay over COVID, we're going to see those emissions start growing again as we, quote, get back to normal. I want to point out that I'm going to talk about the transportation system and not about electrification. Electrification of vehicles is absolutely essential. We need zero emissions vehicles, but it's not sufficient, and it isn't our job. We are going to focus on our part of the job, which is the building of the system and how that impacts greenhouse gas emissions. We've seen the sector increase emissions even as our fleet has gotten more efficient. In fact, between 1990 and 2017, we saw our fleet efficiency increase by nearly 20%, but our emissions still went up 22%. And that's because people were driving, our vehicle miles traveled went up 50%. As driving increases, it limits how much we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by. And it will result in our emitting way more than we would otherwise on the way to electrifying the overall vehicle fleet. It's like filling a bathtub with a leak. You might eventually fill the hole, but you can do a lot of permanent damage to your house and to the floor that will not magically be repaired just because the leak is eventually fixed. It's not as if there are climate gods out there that we can negotiate with and say, we may have emitted millions and billions of additional greenhouse gas, tons of greenhouse gas, but we eventually got to zero. Is that okay? The answer is no. It's too much greenhouse gas. Also, climate emissions go beyond the tailpipe. Climate emissions come from the entire sector. The building of our transportation system emits greenhouse gas emissions. Also, climate impacts go beyond emissions. There is the heat island effect of having too much pavement in people's communities, the loss of greenery, the loss of trees that we take down to build and expand highways that can be absorbing carbon dioxide. There's the environmental and health impacts that go beyond climate, from runoff to habitat loss. There's the health and safety impacts that go beyond the environment completely. Emissions from brakes, tires, and pavement create fine particles that get into our lungs and create permanent health problems. We found that those very particulates left particularly Black and Latina communities more exposed to COVID because of the weakened lung capacity due to particulates that will not be fixed just by removing tailpipe emissions. We know that the pavement itself leaches out these emissions on hot days, those days that will become ever more frequent. And then, of course, there's the increasing number of fatalities, particularly for vulnerable travelers, that we have seen explode even as driving decreased. There's the equity impacts beyond health and safety. The way we built our transportation community divides communities, the transportation system divides communities. It disconnects people from the opportunity they seek and the needs they require. It increases the transportation costs to the household. Transportation costs that are less predictable than other costs that can explode at times like the one we're in now, where all of a sudden fueling your car costs so much more than you might have budgeted for or expected. And impacts people like me less because I live in a community where I don't have to drive, but I'm one of the people least vulnerable to those price spikes, something we really need to address. There are economic impacts of a car-only serving system. It turns out that car-only communities don't perform as well economically. They drive up the cost to the household because more people need more cars and need to use them more frequently. It drives up the cost to the taxpayer because a car-only community tends to be more spread out in order to move more cars, which take up more space. And that requires more infrastructure per taxpayer. And they aren't as attractive to start businesses in or spend time in. And when people spend time in areas, they spend their money in those areas, and therefore it's more beneficial economically. The point is we can make a huge impact on the climate by addressing vehicles, but leave the rest of this problematic system in place. Why would we do that? We can't fix problems of a car-only system with a car-only approach. So we need to look at what's going on, and we need to question underlying assumptions. Most importantly, we need to name what's really going on and stop hiding it. We are making all of these damaging decisions because our top priority is to move cars and to move them quickly. When we start designing a roadway, the first question we ask is how many cars are we going to serve and how quickly are they going to move? We then ask what might be the dangers of cars moving that quickly and how can we get rid of any obstacles to those drivers who might make mistakes at that speed? And all other questions come after that, if we're going to accommodate other users, for example. And those are all things that come up after we set our budget. We can't allow frequent crossings or mid-block crossings on roadways because that's an obstruction. We can't allow left-hand turns so you can get more quickly where you're going because it slows the traffic on that corridor. We can't have a squared off corner because it might add a couple seconds because you have to stop before you turn, as opposed to keep speed as you turn through a crosswalk. We don't like extra street crossings. We want long super blocks because that's another obstruction to quick travel, in spite of the fact it's the thing that creates the network that moves people around more effectively. We don't worry about any of these other things until after we get those cars moving. We try to project 20 years into the future how quickly cars will move, which is an impossible thing to know. What did we project would be happening over the last 2 years just a year ago or a year before it started? What did we project for the city of New Orleans in 2002, a few years before Katrina? And when we project 20 years in advance, because we all know we can't possibly predict it, it's best for our engineers to go for the most bold scenario, which requires overbuilding. And that induces more travel. The concept of induced demand first identified in the early 20th century, something we still don't recognize and we still don't measure. All of these things create a feedback loop that pushes more and more driving and leaves those who may not be able to drive, may choose not to drive, or may not be able to afford to drive, to really take their own lives into their hands in order to move throughout their communities. Then we say they don't choose. We don't choose to get out of a car. We don't look at land use. Transportation agencies point at land use decision makers. Land use authorities point at transportation decision makers. But from the perspective of those of us in transportation, whether it's our responsibility or not, we need to recognize we aid and abet bad land use decision making. Land uses that create congestion by putting destinations far away from people live, by making short distances as the crow flies longer, by having disconnected road networks at the local level. We can complain about that. We can wish they would do better, but we have to recognize we funnel nearly endless amounts of funding to attempt to reduce the congestion that was as predictable by that land use scenario as the sun rising. We don't have to do that. We can explain that the land use that they chose will never allow the congestion to go away. But, at the local level, why learn if your failures lead to being showered with more money? And that is often true for the transportation world itself. When we have a problem with congestion or emissions or repair or safety, use that failure that led to that need as an excuse for more money. We're not expected to make improvements. And whether we make improvements or not, we have a claim for more cash. We know adding capacity doesn't work. The very thing that is pushing us into a scenario of more driving and more emissions isn't even working to reduce congestion. Across the largest 100 communities in the nation, we expanded our freeway network by 42%, while population grew only 32%, and congestion grew 144%. Talk about a failing strategy. It's amazing because it was true no matter what. For those communities growing a lot and didn't build quite as much freeway capacity, they had massive increases in congestion. Those who, like Omaha, Nebraska, that expanded their freeway system by 146% and only had a 45% increase in population, they saw their congestion increase by 231%. And in Buffalo, New York, that saw a 1% reduction, a 12% reduction in its population and added roadway capacity, saw its congestion increase 175%. There are 0 communities in the largest 100 metropolitan areas that saw less than a 45% increase in congestion, even when losing population. If we would stop chasing this impossible standard, when everyone travels at the same time, there will be congestion, full stop. If we don't stop chasing that, we will not address greenhouse gas emissions. It's as simple as that. And everything we're doing is driving costs up to our consumer. The miles driven per person grew by 20% between 1993 and 2017. People are traveling further, something that translates to higher cost to the household, and like we just discussed, higher congestion, higher emissions, more water runoff, greater inequities, and greater fatalities. We're finding these impacts to be even more harsh in rural areas where their destinations are moving further and further away. An area where we use rural areas as an excuse to support the continued car-only approach. While over 1 million households in predominantly rural counties have no car, and the majority of the 292 counties that have 10% or more households with no access to a car are majority rural. So it's amazing. The sacrifices we make to solve congestion don't solve congestion, they just make it worse. And the sacrifices we're called on to make in urban America for rural America are making the situation for rural Americans worse. We really need to start questioning those underlying assumptions. Now, there's some opportunity in the money coming from the infrastructure bill passed by Congress last fall. However, there's nothing in the infrastructure bill that will require us to change the product we create or the trajectory we are on. We will have to do that. The opportunity is there. There's a huge new rail program. The rail program is now almost as large as the transit program. And that is very exciting and has great opportunity for longer distance travel and community to community travel. We have the same transit program that we had before because that was the only thing we could come to bipartisan agreement on. And there's still an 80-20 split between transit and highways, though we now see that transit and rail make up about a third of the pot together, a little bit more. While there are historic levels of competitive grant funds and some exciting competitive grant programs, when you add them all up, that historic amount is 5.5% of the overall program. There, like I said, great opportunity here, but it's not going to transform the program alone. There are new formula grant programs specifically for climate and resilience. There's a carbon reduction program and a resilience program called Protect, which are very exciting. There's a competitive grant component and a formula grant component that can allow states and metropolitan planning organizations to really focus on those issues. But 75% of formula grant programs will be in the form of the National Highway Performance Program and the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, which means that 75% of the pie is still with the traditional programs that have led us to today. So if we care to make an impact and shift our direction, we're going to need to spend those dollars differently to get different results. We can't just rely on the programs that have the name of our goal on them to address those goals. Every dollar we spend has to be about climate if we want to redirect this huge ship, or we're going to continue to get exactly what we've always gotten. So let's finish up by talking about some of the tools available to redirect the funding that is greatly flexible, that can be used to get different results. One is, as I mentioned, we're not measuring the demand that we induce. When we build more capacity, we invite more travel. This is a dynamic system and people respond to it. This is not hydrology with a finite amount of water. This is people moving, and people will add trips, shift trips, move modes, all based on where we're investing. When we add roadway capacity, like we have found since the 1920s, people add trips to that roadway. And we end up with more congestion, which is why we have found that every single community, even those losing population, have more congestion. We have made it easier for people to figure out what the expected induced demand is. And based on work from the University of California at Davis and the great work that they've done, the work by Jamie Volker and Susan Handy, we have worked with the Rocky Mountain Institute to create the SHIFT calculator, a national calculator that breaks down county by county in every state in the union in order to determine what a roadway expansion will do in terms of induced demand. So that if you don't have your own induced demand model, you can use ours, and you can use it and learn from it and make it a little more specialized and integrated into your system. There's no magic behind it. It's just based on about 100 years of study of this phenomenon. We can also use the technology that we have all become so reliant on in our smartphones that we hold in the very palm of our hand to measure something much more user-friendly and consumer-friendly than how fast vehicles are moving. Think about it right now. If vehicles are moving at a fast clip at the expected speed, people don't have to arrive at their destination for our transportation system to get a good score. We don't measure whether people arrive. We don't measure their trip. We only measure the speed across a particular observed segment right now. So if people drive in circles, but at speed forever, that is an A+ system. But if people travel in congestion and arrive where they need to go in 10 minutes, that's something that needs to be solved. Well, that's backwards. We're not rating the convenience of the travel or the access to the things you need, but using GIS and using things like basically the same technology that powers Google Maps and can look at all the different modes of transportation. We can look at whether or not people can reach the destinations they need quickly, conveniently, safely by all modes of travel. It is more consumer focused. It's more equity focused. You can look at that accessibility by income level. And you can look particularly at whether or not we're serving BIPOC communities fairly. It allows all modes to be compared. It allows land use and transportation to be compared. Is this a transportation problem to be solved with a transportation project? Or is it a land use problem that can be solved by moving some of people's necessities closer to where they live? And it gives us greater overall insights into how people are moving and what we're getting from the transportation system. For example, we've learned through the work we've done with places like Madison, Wisconsin, the state of Virginia, Washington State, and others, that it's really the non-work trip that determines how many cars a household will have, how much people have to drive, and what modes they choose. I mean, once you've got the sunk cost of a car, you're going to choose to use it more. But it's that non-work trip that pushes people to have to buy a car or more cars, because so little of our transportation system is designed to serve that trip. We're so overly focused on congestion reduction that we focus on peak times and that one trip to work, in spite of the fact that it's only, before COVID, was only 20% of people's trips and 30% of their vehicle miles traveled. Using accessibility allows us to consider congestion and congestion reduction, but only one of dozens of opportunities to improve people's access to necessities and to work and economic opportunity and to improve their quality of life. As accessibility increases for non-work destinations, climate emissions go down. We can also look to other states and regions and what they're doing, like the state of Colorado and Colorado Department of Transportation, which has just adopted a greenhouse gas pollution reduction program that requires all projects to be measured in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions from that project and requires mitigation to reduce that impact. There's really exciting things going on across the country. And we can learn from them. Is anybody doing everything right? No. But there's enough going right that if we pluck from everyone, we can put it all together in a very exciting way. And one thing I think it's really important for us to recognize is we're no longer talking about preventing climate change. We're only talking about how much climate change we're going to prevent, because we took too long to make the hard decisions and the decisions that were required to be made to be able to prevent it. So we should be throwing everything in the kitchen sink out there to reduce the impacts that climate change can cause and reduce our impacts to the climate. So to sum up, overall, the big things we need to do in transportation, we need to think about land use and how our decisions impact land use, and how we encourage people to make land use decisions that will only require us in transportation to come back and invest more. We don't need to feed that loop. We can interrupt it. We can stop subsidizing and embedding land use decisions that can only result in more need for transportation investment. If we really focus on our roadway design and making safety the top priority instead of moving vehicles quickly, we can make it possible for more short trips, both in and out of a car. Right now, we focus so much, again, on moving corridors quickly, we cut off shorter car trips, and in doing so, we make shorter walking trips out of the question. And we can invest heavily in non-car options. We have spent 70 to 100 years investing in helping people move around by car. We are in a deep hole with regard to other modes of transportation. We are not going to remove ourselves from that hole by investing 20% of what we invest in highways in other modes. We are going to have to at least match what we're spending for those driving in those not driving if we want to become anywhere close to bringing them onto equal footing and being able to claim that we've given our consumers anything close to a choice. Specifically, we should be measuring greenhouse gas emissions by project, by tip, and looking both forward and backward. You can't claim that it's a priority if you're not measuring it. And we can look at people like CDOT and look at ways to require mitigation to reduce that impact. We can address the problems of now rather than trying to guess the unguessable of what might happen in 20 years, a process that leads to overbuilding and inducing more demand. We can measure induced demand. We can therefore have a better understanding of what our investments are going to do in terms of future congestion, real benefit, and greenhouse gas emissions, as well as all the other impacts we talked about. Frankly, we need to do a lot to look at our overall modeling, but I think we need to start with just rethinking the question we ask and our beginning question is, What will the traffic be at the end of the useful life of this thing we're building? We can define the problem differently. If we start using the technology we hold in our smartphones in our transportation system, we can get a much richer understanding of how the transportation system is working and how it's connecting people to the things they need. And then we will have dozens of solutions at our fingertips to solve the problem, not just investing in speeding up vehicles along one corridor. We can also build our priorities into every single project. Again, don't only do your carbon reduction work in the carbon reduction program. If carbon reduction is going to be our priority, it's going to be done with every dollar spent. And we can look at our rules, procedures, standards, trainings, performance reviews. Embedded in so many of those processes is the origins of our program, the building out of the national highway system in an interstate program. And what we need to do is look through all of them and ask, is doing what we want in reducing emissions the easiest thing to do with all of those rules, procedures, standards, trainings, and performance reviews? Or does it require our people, our staff, our engineers and planners to go out on a limb? We need to make it the easy thing to do. So I will just end, since Grace started out by talking about the Daniel Burnham Award with a Daniel Burnham quote, one quite famous: "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood and probably will not themselves be realized. Make big plans, aim high, and hope and work, remembering that a noble logical diagram once recorded will never die, but long after we are gone will be a living thing, asserting itself with ever-growing insistency. Don't shoot low. You'll get all the garbage for change for doing a little thing and not the benefit. Go big and have a chance at really changing our direction and creating a better future." Thank you so much for having me.
That's great.
Thank you again to Beth Osborne for those great keynote remarks. Now I'd like to introduce Joe McDonald, NOACA Director of Strategic and Environmental Planning, to conduct the first of 3 interactive poll questions with our audience. Joe?
Thank you, Grace. And I would like to welcome all the attendees and those who are tuned in to the summit via our YouTube channel. It really is wonderful to have you with us this morning. We want to take this opportunity to pose a question to summit attendees to better gauge climate action interest. For those of you on YouTube, you may visit NOACA's new MindMixer platform titled NOACA Live to register and participate as we conduct this poll throughout the summit. You may utilize the QR code you see or the link, both of which are shown on your screen. This question and other poll questions will be on the MindMixer platform and available for response at any time, now or after the summit. So feel free to encourage others to participate as well. So for the first question, how interested or committed is your organization to taking action on climate? And we'll give folks a few seconds to respond, and then we can discuss the results. Okay. Looks like most people who have participated. So we'll go ahead and end. And what we see here We don't have a majority of any one response, but 43% are interested in developing a climate plan. 31% are willing to consider the benefits of a climate plan. And a quarter of the respondents have already completed a climate plan. So very strong support for climate planning, at least the idea of it. And more than 2/3 have either already done it or are looking to develop one themselves. So that shows a lot of support, which is not a surprise given that this is a climate action summit and you are the audience that is participating. So wonderful to see. So thank you everyone for taking our first poll question. And now we will send it back to Grace.
Thank you, Joe. We are now at the part of our summit where I'd like to introduce our partners for a brief discussion on the importance of climate action in Northeast Ohio. Welcome to the platform, Ron Richard, President and CEO of the Cleveland Foundation, and Tony Richardson, President of the George Gund Foundation. Thank you both for your leadership and partnership with NOACA for this much needed summit. Before our discussion, I'd first like to give you the opportunity to speak on your organization's respective commitments to climate action. Ron? Or Tony?
Great, Grace, I'll jump in. Thank you, and thanks to NOACA and your team, Grace, and your leadership for convening this summit. And so I'll just start at a high level, and I want to be mindful of time to know Ron has to jump off. Since the Paris Climate Accords were signed in 2015, the George Gund Foundation has used the agreement to really guide and shape his work on climate. And the Paris Agreement, as you all know, is a legally binding international treaty on climate, which at a high level aims to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so to achieve this goal, we know that we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80% by 2050. And quite honestly, many scientists think this is not aggressive enough. And we also have to be on the path towards 40% reduction by 2030. As you all are aware, the city of Cleveland was the first, or one of the first, US cities to adopt an 80% reduction by 2050 target. And so as you know, there'll be a lot of people today talking about climate action and what we can do, and we have federal representation. And so you will hear a lot about many of the advancements made on the federal level to address climate, but we have a long way to go here in Ohio. Ohio is actually the third largest greenhouse emitter in the US. And if we were our own country, we'd be the 26th largest emitter in the world. And so we know that the foundation the work that we support in Northeast Ohio has significant global implications. And we really want to center all of our work around carbon mitigation efforts, around climate justice, racial equity, and we believe that NOACA can be a catalyst for climate work, right? And be a leader in helping Ohio improve on climate while simultaneously strengthen our economy. And last but not least, when we think about our existing manufacturing base and infrastructure, we believe that Northeast Ohio can become a leader in clean energy innovation, investment, talent, and jobs. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, or back to you, Grace.
Ron?
Yes, hi.
Good morning.
Good morning. Great. Well, I'll answer the question now then about how the Cleveland Foundation is thinking about climate change. And of course, we do everything hand in glove with the Gund Foundation. So we're working very closely and coordinating very closely with them. But I would just say in terms of how are we thinking about climate change, I'll tell you honestly, the way I'm thinking about climate change is if we don't do something dramatic about climate change, all the rest of our work will be meaningless. If you think of Katrina in New Orleans, and if you had been, let's say, the CEO of the New Orleans Community Foundation a couple of years before Katrina, and if you'd had a crystal ball and you had a choice, should I continue to fund the YMCA and the food bank and the Rape Crisis Center and all the important organizations you fund, Or should I just focus on strengthening the levees so all these organizations aren't literally underwater in 2 years? You might have said we need to strengthen the levees, and that's sort of how I view climate change. Is everything depends on it, and so there's terrible consequences of not working on climate change, and there are also at the same time tremendous opportunities because of climate change. We can create jobs in Tennessee, a red state. The advanced energy sector added jobs. They paid higher than average wages and grew the state's economy by 8.2%, contributing $45.8 billion between just 2016 and 2019. And it outpaced the state's overall economic growth, that one sector. And that's very much what I would like to see happen in Ohio. Although Ohio's been very challenged with very bad public policy in the energy and environmental sector in recent years, which we really have to turn around. And of course, we have to ensure that all these new jobs are equitable. Currently less than 10% of America's clean energy jobs are held by African Americans and Latinos, and we have to ensure that growth in advanced energy is equitable. We have to make the grid more resilient. I mean, if you look at what's going on in the Ukraine right now, and this is, how I felt, for 18 years now, the Cleveland Foundation's been trying to put the first freshwater wind farm in Lake Erie off of Cleveland. If you think of the Ukraine, a single missile could take out a coal power plant or, God forbid, a nuclear power plant. A little harder to attack, 10,000, freestanding, wind turbines. And so from an energy resilience point and a national security standpoint, we really need to get to distributed energy. We have to make the grid more resilient. Just looking at Cleveland, and we're probably not too much different, Cleveland Public Power has got 100-year-old substations that, could blow any day now. We really have to fix the grid, the national grid, but just locally even, we have to do something to make sure that people aren't shivering in their homes, with a power outage in the middle of winter. We see gas prices rising steeply because of Russians' invasion of the Ukraine, and that's, a great reminder about how vulnerable we are to the fossil fuel market dynamics. And so, there's great opportunities for jobs and for improved health, but there's real national security and human rights implications. Europe is very straitjacketed because of its dependence on Russian oil and gas in terms of, what they can do to combat this just human rights tragedy going on in the Ukraine. So for all these reasons, we care deeply about combating climate change and view it as the moral imperative of our age. I'll stop there, Grace, but.
Thank you very much for both of your comments. You've both given us something to think about relative to climate action in Northeast Ohio, including some of the reasons that we need to think of this as urgent. What types of approaches are necessary to mobilize communities to work together here in Northeast Ohio? How do we get that done? Tony or Ron, either one?
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about this later on in our discussion, Grace. But I think it's important that stakeholders and partners such as Gunn and Cleveland Foundation, as well as NOACA, and obviously thinking about NOACA's 5-county footprint and the ability to convene and coordinate and bring communities together around these issues. And I think we in philanthropy, we understand that no single entity or organization can carry this work on its own, right? So while we can fund equitable climate and clean energy transition plans or decarbonize grid planning and implementation, I think it's also important that, there's a hub where we can sort of cross-pollinate, share ideas, create a regional strategy that's tied and coordinated to what's happening at the state level as well as at the federal level, so that there is coordination between what's happening and opportunities that can be created here on a local level. And so I do think that there needs to be a hub. Someone needs to like really lead this work. We can't do it alone. And as Ron articulately pointed out, you know, this issue is really tied to not just the existential threat of humanity, but also our global competitiveness as a region, right? And so I'll park there and let Ron jump in if he has anything to add.
I would just say that I think that sorry, trying to remember the question for a second. Grace, can you help me out again?
Yeah, sure. Just, you know, you talked a lot about the overall urgency of climate action.
Right.
And how do we get people to see that and be involved?
Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. I had a senior moment there. I think that, you know, we have to get better at coalition building in this field. We have to do it like never before. You know, just that, I hope we get to a point in this country and in this state where certain things should just be beyond partisan politics. I mean, we all breathe the same air, as JFK said a long time ago. We all, you know, need clean water. And so I think that we have to do a better job of reaching that across the aisle. And, you know, there are hunters and fishermen and people in agriculture in this state in rural areas, and most of the state of Ohio is rural, and most of the country is rural. And the environmental movement's been sort of urban based, and we really need to bring in coalition partners. I'm glad that in Ohio now there is a group, you know, Conservatives for the Environment. So we've just got to do a much better job of, you know, coalition building and partnerships. And then I think also in terms of, you know, corporate interests, there is money to be made in the clean water sector. In water technology sector, there is money to be made in producing wind turbines. This state knows how to bend steel, and we have steel plants, and we've got companies like Eaton and Parker Hannifin that make storage systems, you know, for wind turbines. And so we have to find a way to get the corporate community and the environmental community, the agricultural community, and others in the state that just enjoy, you know, the natural environment, you know, to really work on this and really influence state laws. We've been hampered by just a few, you know, companies like Murray Cole and others that have outsized influence in the legislature. And I think we really need to do a lot of public policy advocacy to turn that around and, you know, get a level playing field.
Thank you, Ron. I think that's right on target. What happens if we do nothing here in Northeast Ohio? Tony?
So, I mean, I think it's more of the same, right? I mean, as I mentioned and pointed out earlier, I think we're the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the country. And we can easily become number one, right? And we become a less attractive place to do business in the future. And if we don't do anything, I mean, who knows? I mean, we can be wiped off the face of the planet. I mean, I don't want to be that extreme, right? Or put, you know, fear into anyone, but this is an urgent issue. And I think we owe it to future generations. And during our time here on Earth, we have to be mindful of making sure that future generations can take advantage of the opportunities that are here and just life, right? Health and safety and wellness. And then last but not least, I think our again, I keep talking about our viability as a region, right? In terms of the economy. And so we can do nothing, or we can really step into this moment, own it, and become champions for this work.
Thank you, Tony. I think what's important as a message out of there is we often look at ourselves and say, little old Northeast Ohio, we're just a small part of the nation. We're just a small part of the world. But when it comes to climate change, we're actually not that small. And I think your points really come across and take that message home.
Grace, I'd like to answer that too, if I could.
Please.
You know, about 18 years ago, I was giving a speech at the City Club, and in the Q&A, someone asked me if I thought that Cleveland could ever come back, if we could ever, you know, get our population back, because we had shrunk so much population-wise. And my answer, which was not a sarcastic answer, it was a very serious answer, was I had no doubt that 30 years from now, Cleveland will probably have the largest population it's ever had. And I explained that the reason I felt that was that prior to coming here, I worked at the Central Intelligence Agency, and I was sitting in George Tenet's office one day, the head of the CIA, and he got a call, I think it was from the Saudi Intel chief, and he said, "This may take a long time, Ron. Here, read this report." And he handed me a report, and it was the CIA's analysis. It's since been declassified, so I can talk about it. It was the CIA's analysis of the impacts of climate change on the United States, including our military force postures, but just also movements of population. And it had maps like 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, which showed, you know, much of the East Coast underwater. And where are all those people in Florida and the Carolinas and even Washington, D.C. Gonna go? And I thought, well, they're gonna go somewhere where there's fresh water and somewhere that's got a high enough elevation that we're not gonna be underwater. And Cleveland's looking pretty good. I don't want Cleveland to benefit from the misery of other people. But, you know, to answer your question, what happens if we don't do anything? If we don't do anything, this nation's going to have to spend trillions of dollars, which we don't have, on seawalls. And if we don't do anything to get off of coal, you'd never be able to eat walleye fish out of Lake Erie. We're going to have really serious problems with, you know, drought and as a result of that, serious increases in food prices and even scarcity of food. I mean, it is a really catastrophic vision if we don't do something. If we don't do something really soon. So I think there's nothing more urgent for us to work on than this.
Thank you very much. Those were terrific statements, and I appreciate both Ron Richard and Tony Richardson for joining us for this discussion. We will hear more from Tony later in the program, and I want to sum this up by saying, if we do nothing, as Tony and Ron said, we have a community that doesn't thrive and that perhaps even dies. If we do something, we have a future ahead of us that is resilient and that allows us to really put in place the long-range plan, the equitable plan that we have developed at NOACA. And so with that, I do thank you very much. And I know we now have a special message from U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown.
I'm Sherrod Brown. It's a privilege to serve the people of Greater Cleveland and all of Ohio in the U.S. Senate. Grace, thank you and everyone with Northeast Ohio Area-wide Coordinating Agency for the work you do. It's great to speak with NOACA again after our conversation in January about infrastructure and how we're going to create jobs in every city, every town.
I think we've frozen.
Township in our state. You know better than just about anyone that transportation and infrastructure are intimately connected with the environment. The science is clear that the climate crisis is real. It's threatening our communities in Ohio. It threatens our lake. It threatens key infrastructure. It threatens people's energy bills. And politicians that aren't accepting of that simply are science deniers or demagogues. Right now, we need to take concrete action. When we passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, we took a big step towards a low carbon future. We'll replace Ohio's aging bus fleets with modern zero emission vehicles. We dedicated $7 billion to build electric vehicle charging stations. We made a historic investment in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative to protect and clean up our lake that so many Ohioans depend on. Think about this. Now we have a president who actually knows about the Great Lakes and believes in the Great Lakes, and whatever party any of you are that are watching, we know the threat we faced from President Trump, who tried to eliminate the Great Lakes Initiative, and now President Biden has specifically come to Lorain, come to the North Shore, if you will, of Ohio, to invest more in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. We know what that means. Ohioans has proved for years that we don't have to choose between cleaning up the environment and growing the economy. There's a reason President Biden chose the shore of Lake Erie to announce that record-setting $1 billion. You know that in Northeast Ohio, better than just about anyone, look at the development, look at the jobs, and the quality of life that depend on the lake. Think about the investments in the infrastructure bill that Senator Portman and I worked on. Every one of those investments going to create jobs, grow new industries. The charging station built by American workers with American raw materials. The auto industry in Ohio and across the Midwest is making plans for the cars of the future. And then those are going to be EVs. And with record federal investment in public transit, Amtrak, pedestrian infrastructure, we can build a more equitable and environmentally friendly transportation network. I applaud NOACA. I applaud our local leaders for working toward a regional commitment to a low carbon future for Northeast Ohio. We continue this momentum. The health of Ohioans depends on it. Please keep up your efforts. Keep speaking out. Your work is so very, very important for our region.
Thank you so much for your inspiring message, Senator Brown. Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome our first panel of the summit to discuss the case for climate action planning. There will be a brief period at the end of the panel to entertain questions from the audience. Please type your questions at any time through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. NOACA staff will consider all questions as time permits. The moderator for this panel is John Mitterholzer, Program Director for Climate and Environmental Justice at the George Gunn Foundation. Director Mitterholzer.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to be able to moderate this panel. We're going to hear from 3 individuals who have worked on their own climate action plans, and we're going to learn what it was like for them to be a part of that process. We have someone from Kansas City, so we're going to hear about the regional plan of Kansas City, and then we have two local folks who are going to talk about the work that they've done locally, and then also how the NOACA plan can help advance that work that they've been doing for a couple of years now. We're joined today by Karen Clausen, Lyndon Arbogast, and Mike Foley. And for time reasons, I've asked them all to just introduce themselves, tell them a little bit about themselves. I've also asked them to start off by telling us about the planning processes that they were part of. If they could just talk a little bit about those processes, the goals of those climate action plans that they worked on. And if I can ask our panelists one additional question as you give that overview, what's something that you learned coming out of that process that was that might have been unexpected? So we're going to start with Karen and work in Kansas City. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Karen Clausen. I'm a principal planner with Mid-America Regional Council, and I'm really happy to be here. We completed our climate action plan for the entire region, having adopted that in March of last year. So I'm really excited to share a lot more about that plan. John, you want me to continue with kind of talking about our process? Great.
Yeah, that would be great. If you could just talk a little bit about the process, what you learned doing that process, that would be really helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, so it was a really exciting project. I think it was something pretty different for us at a planning level. The impetus for creating this plan was the formation of a kind of a local coalition of elected leaders who are interested in doing something about climate change. We'd never seen something like this happen where a group of elected officials came together. They were being very courageous and then decided to, bring this coalition together. They helped Mark move in the direction of joining the Global Covenant of Mayors. And for those of you not familiar with that group, it's basically a program out of the European Union's International Urban Cooperation. And we joined, so Mark joined on behalf of the region, and we participated ultimately in a regional program that was kind of a pilot, because as you know, most climate plans are developed at a kind of local city level. And so regional plans weren't that common when we started this process. And so they provided technical assistance to us. So we worked in partnership with Climate Action KC to develop this plan. It took us about 18 months to complete the process. We did not have any funding allocated to our planning process. And so I think it took a little bit longer, but we pulled staff together and figured out how to do it ourselves. And it was a great process overall. And the stakeholders and the leadership were constant through the entire thing. So.
Thanks, Karen. Linda, could you tell us a little bit about Oberlin's plan and the work that you've been doing over in Oberlin?
Thanks, John. I really appreciate being here today. And I want to start out by giving a brief overview of the City of Oberlin's climate action planning process. So the City of Oberlin has had a climate action plan since 2007, and we have updated that plan 3 times, with the most recent edition being in 2019. So with that addition came the hiring of a sustainability coordinator, which is me, and it is the first time that the city had a designated person to focus on implementing that climate action plan. So the plan, the process was brought on by City Council. Oberlin is run by City Council, and City Council got together and decided which key areas the City of Oberlin wanted to focus on. So in our plan, we have transportation, green buildings, waste management, renewable energy, land use agriculture, water, and resilience. Because as Director Osborne shared, we have quite a bit of climate change ahead of us, regardless of our mitigation efforts. So we started with a lead person who was the closest we could find to an expert in each of those categories to lead those chapters. And they were charged with engaging the community on each of those topics. So that is something I would share, is that one of the most important things you can do in a climate action plan is to find many ways to engage the community. And it's probably the most important thing, and it may be the hardest thing as well. It doesn't happen just easily. You can't just say, hey, I'm going to have a meeting on this day and anyone interested show up. You have to really work at that community engagement and go to some unconventional places, perhaps churches, schools, libraries, and really reach out to the community so that they understand that this plan isn't just the city's plan, but it's the community plan, and that they feel like they've had input so that there's buy-in. The second thing I would say that we did that really helped us was join ICLEI. ICLEI is an international group, and it's an acronym that's in German, but it stands for Sustainable Cities. So as an office of one, it really helped me to be a part of this initiative, where I work with cohorts, so that when I'm doing my greenhouse gas inventory, I'm not doing it on my own, but I have a cohort of communities throughout the United States and even the world who are working on these same efforts. I mentioned having a sustainability coordinator. It really does help to have someone whose job it is to focus on implementing your climate action plan every day. It is obviously clear that one person can't do any of this, but one person can focus on it and engage the community and keep the conversation going. We're also fortunate in Oberlin that we have designated funding to implement our climate action plan. So that's something, if at all possible, to have some funds. And again, those funds will likely not be able to implement all the work you want to do, but they will be there to be seed funding so that I can actually open my door to community members who want to walk in and say, hey, I have a great idea about electrifying transportation. So come on in and I can work with them and develop proposals. And in the last 3 years, that's how we have really gotten to our goals. And I want to just end by saying that in 2015, we met our goal of reducing our emissions by half from our 2012 baseline. And our next goal is in 2030 to get to 75%. And it's a tough one. And as you get closer, it gets harder and harder. And I think you all know that. So having designated funding really helps. There's a lot more I could say, and I really look forward to the rest of this morning.
Thanks, Linda. I appreciate that overview of Oberlin's work. Mike Foley, could you talk about your work at Cuyahoga County?
Yep, thanks, John, and thanks, NOACA. So I'm Mike Foley. I'm the Sustainability Director for Cuyahoga County, and I've been here since 2015. And we started doing climate action planning, especially after President Trump announced that he was going to be getting out of the Paris Climate Accord. So Executive Budish called me up one day and said, Mike, this is really bad. Is there anything we can do locally, right? Can we start, reacting to kind of the bad policy at the national and state level? And so we did some investigation, and like Kansas City, we looked at the Global Covenant of Mayors kind of protocol, and we joined that. There's a nice cohort of cities and counties and local governments that are starting to think about this stuff and have been thinking about this stuff for a while. And out of that, we looked at the methodologies that other local governments had been putting together in terms of putting together climate change action plans. So we jumped on board, and in 2018, we were able to get some money out of the county to help do an explicit planning around putting together a climate change action plan, working with our county planning department, our county board of health, our solid waste district, our soil and water conservation district. So we tried to put a number of organizations together who explicitly work around county government to start thinking about what are the things that we need to both measure and implement. And I think, John, I think implicitly one of the things we all understood, and I think our county council understands and our local government understands, that this is a problem, right? This is not, this isn't some phony, kind of thing that doesn't exist, and that we have to deal with it. But what are the things that we specifically can do at the county? So, one of the things we really wanted to do is just try to describe as accurately as possible what climate change would mean to the region. So we know that we're going to be a warmer, it's the 4 W's, right? The warmer, wetter, wilder weather in our community. And so how do you describe that? How do you put graphs together to make that explicit to folks? And so our county planning department has done a really good job of kind of putting together graphs and maps and doing an explainer of that. But then the other stuff of that is, what's the implementation part of that? So we know we need more trees. We know we need to work on energy. We know we need more infrastructure for electric vehicle charging stations. And I think we all knew that those are things we needed to do. But one of the things the plan gives us is kind of that thing to point to and say, hey, we've done this analysis, we've done this kind of processing of what we need to do, and we can point to that. And it gives us just kind of another argument to buttress kind of stuff that I think that implicit we always knew we needed to do: increase energy resiliency and clean energy. So we've put together solar. We've got a large solar farm and a landfill. We've got a lot of rooftop solar now. We've got a residential solar co-op that we work with. We've created our own county utility, and part of the reasons is that we've been able to use that plan as kind of the not justification, but at least kind of the one of the bases for us to kind of think about some of that work. I agree that funding is really important, right? So as Linda said, there's got to be some resources available just to work on this stuff. And At least at the county level, we've been lucky. We've had some real champions in our county, our local county government, including Executive Budish, but also Councilman Miller and Councilwoman Simon, who are on our county council, really been thoughtful about this. So I think you need some champions in local government as well to work on some of this stuff. So I'll stop there and we can we can go on. We'll answer more questions.
Thanks, Mike. We've got a couple of questions in the queue already. I've got one more question I'm going to ask, and then I would encourage those who are watching to use the Q&A feature and submit your questions as well. Karen, I have a question for you in Kansas City. I mean, we certainly know the urgency of the moment. We know how much, how fast we need to move to really start reducing greenhouse gas emissions globally and then in our own places where we live. I wonder if you could give an example of how your climate action planning helped accelerate some of the work you were already doing, or help to implement some programs that you hadn't been able to implement, but were able to use the plan as a way to do so. If you could just give us an example or two of how that happened in the Kansas City region, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, I think the biggest momentum and implementation that we've seen has really been at the local level. Mark has always been involved in climate resilience work, and either through our environmental program.
Karen, you went on mute there accidentally.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so I think at the local level is where we've seen a lot of that momentum. Some of the things that we have seen as we, after we adopted the plan is several of our counties and many of our cities have adopted the plan or passed a resolution of support or some similar action. There had been many cities and counties throughout the region who have already been working on climate resilience work to a certain degree, but it didn't have a lot of oomph and power behind it. It didn't have a goal or a target they were necessarily trying to reach. And so I think having that target in place at a regional level has really pushed them to kind of look at our plan and kind of figure out what their own pathway is towards reducing our carbon emissions. A couple of examples, one of our cities, the city of Overland Park, which is a larger suburban city in our region, they're working on adopting the plan right now, but almost right away they took our plan and did kind of an audit of their own planning work against our climate action plan, an audit of their comprehensive planning and some of their other smaller plans as well, to identify where there's overlap, where there's synergies, things that they might kind of push on a little bit harder, where there might be gaps in some of their planning. And they also decided to create from the outcomes of that audit, putting together kind of a transportation resilience kind of work group or committee that would really focus in on transportation issues, because that had been really important to that city. We've seen a lot of other cities begin pushing things like solar ready housing and focusing in on making sure that we have enough electric vehicle charging infrastructure in place. And we've had really good partnerships. So moving beyond kind of city government partnerships with utilities have been good. I don't think that every region is blessed with utilities that are good working partners. And our electric utility, which is called Evergy, is doing a lot of great things to help transition their power generation towards more renewable options. They have created a program for cities to opt in to a kind of a new business model where they will be paying slight premiums for this, but they're basically buying all renewable energy to power their city operations. And our utility is extending that to businesses as well of a certain size. And so those are a few examples of some of the things that we've seen. And as we continue to engage with cities and counties, I believe we'll see more of that coming out. There's still, of course, some cities and counties that have yet to really engage in this work, but not because there's opposition necessarily. I think just the way that they've done things is a little bit different. So we anticipate a lot more exciting changes and planning into the future.
Thanks, Karen. That's really exciting to hear about how that work is sort of accelerating at this point. We have a question from the audience. We have a question from Cuyahoga County Councilmember Dale Miller. And he's asking, and Linda, I'm going to throw this to both you and Mike. So Cleveland and Cuyahoga County, and I would say Oberlin as well, already have climate action plans. So how do you envision collaboration among NOACA? How can the work that NOACA is doing help you implement those plans or accelerate work that you're doing? And Mike or Linda, you can take that one, or both of you.
I'll start. So I feel like today is the day we've started that. I mean, I was thrilled to be asked to come to this, and I so appreciate NOACA taking this on. I think, you know, Oberlin is a town of 8,000 people in the middle of Lorain County. And the fact that we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050 is going to be pretty meaningless if we cannot make this a regional and then a state and then a national conversation and effort. So big thanks to NOACA. NOACA is also helping us with our EV infrastructure. We received a grant to put a DC fast charger in our City Hall parking lot. We have some level 2 chargers, but this will be our first DC fast charge. So building infrastructure, coordinating regional meetings, I think that is the place for NOACA, and I'm super excited to be a part of it.
Yeah, and yeah, I agree with Linda, and it's a good question, Councilman Miller. You know, NOACA is, look, they're the experts on transportation, and as kind of at the beginning of the session, you know, Grace said, you know, Grace or Joe, I forget, said 28% of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the transportation sector. As a county that's put together our own climate change action plan, we recognize that transportation is a factor, obviously, that we need to address locally. But we don't have the levers and tools like NOACA potentially does, or RTA, or kind of the transportation experts to really dig deep and figure out what are kind of the things that we should be doing and the impacts that climate change will have on the region. So this is, I think it's vital. And when we put together our climate change action plan, you know, NOACA was really helpful. They said, you know, look, here's, if we want to get to, you know, climate, you know, zero emissions by 2050, here's what we're going to need to get to by 2030. Here's the amount of public, you know, transit ridership we're going to need to increase. Here's the amount of EV charging infrastructure we're going to need, and they've continued to kind of think through that. But I think really having NOACA do a really deep dive on this is vital to get to where our goals need to be. And it's, you know, both in terms of, you know, what's the, you know, what is that ridership for public transit? What are the kind of the new modes of transportation that are out there? There's going to be a lot of EVs out in the road. What's the infrastructure we're going to need? I think the other part of this is just the impact climate change is going to have on infrastructure, on roads and bridges in the future. So as we've got warmer weather in the future, what does that mean to you know, pavement conditions? And does that mean we're going to see more potholes or sinkholes, things like that? And I think those are things that NOACA can help us measure and model moving into the future.
Thanks, Mike. Linda, I've got a specific question from you coming from Sam Bell, wanting to know about sustainability managers or directors. The question is, you know, I've heard that these positions often pay for themselves. Can you talk about that a little bit and the value that having a sustainability staff person for a community is to that community?
So yeah, how to pay for it is an interesting question. I can tell you how Oberlin pays for it right now, and I don't know that it will be this way forever, but the city of Oberlin created a sustainable reserve fund that was created through the buying and selling of renewable energy credits over the course of several years. And then council decided as an entity that money should go towards sustainability community-wide. So the fund was set aside to implement the climate action plan, which included my salary. So we are 3 years into that 5-year project, and I do believe that the city of Oberlin will continue to have a sustainability coordinator after 5 years. But like I said earlier, I think that if you don't have one person whose job it is to look every day at those goals and move the bar ahead, it's just really hard for other department heads in their busy days to focus in on it. But yet what I can do is I can go to the public works director and talk about our tree canopy. And I can go to our municipal electric director and say, you know, what % of our electric is coming from renewables right now? And so it's my job, and I'm kind of maybe a pain to all of those directors, but I think there's probably one or two who appreciate me. But yeah, it's tough if you don't have someone to focus on it. We are looking at how we will pay for that this position in an ongoing fashion, but for now, it's through our Sustainable Reserve Fund.
Thanks, Linda. I've got a couple of questions about metrics. So Karen, I'm going to turn to you because I am curious about this. So what are some of the metrics that you're using to make sure your plan is on track, that you're making progress? And then have you built a review process in to update that plan? And what does that look like?
Those are great questions. Yes, so we do have a set of what I'll say pending metrics for the plan. We're in the process of working on setting up a new council called the Climate and Environment Council that will kind of be the first step in the process to develop those metrics. One of the ones we're working on right now among our transportation staff, however, is trying to set a VMT and electric vehicle target. Those are some of the first ones that we called out in the climate action plan that we wanted to tackle. But some of the metrics that we're looking forward to putting in place, so include those. I think we want to have some that focus on green infrastructure, and you know, whether that's kind of looking at tree canopy coverage in the region, that will be a focus of one. Number of kind of installed green infrastructure improvements. We have several different kind of climate action areas in our plan. So we have ones that we'll be focusing on that are kind of food and agriculture related. So acreage that is considered regenerative agriculture practices, whether that's, you know, cover cropping or what have you. Urban gardening as well will be included in that. We have some engagement metrics that we'll be tracking as well, because our plan from the very beginning was very sort of equity centered, as I think, you know, all climate action plans need to be. And so we'll have engagement metrics as well that are really focused on that. Some of which might be include you know, number of organizations that kind of exist in our climate vulnerable neighborhoods that have been engaged through the process and are you know, actively receiving resources from MARC or other entities, whether that's, you know, grant funding or tools from us to help implement their own climate action agendas. So that process of developing those metrics and like kind of formally adopting them, we think will take place kind of in the latter half of this year and then next year as well.
Thanks, Karen. That's really helpful. I've got an excellent question from Chad Stevens, and this is open to all three of you. So what are you doing? What have you done to ensure that Black and Brown residents are being a part of the planning and decision-making process when it comes to your climate action plans? So how are we thinking about our residents of color, and how are we engaging them in meaningful ways? And anyone who wants to answer that, the floor is yours.
I'll start. Certainly an important question, and kind of an ongoing question, as is the whole question of community engagement. I will say that my feeling is when we adopted this climate action plan update in 2020, while there had been some community engagement, my feeling was it wasn't enough. And so when I started my job that year, I started in the community engagement focus and really looking at inclusion and diversity and who wasn't a part of this conversation. it was not easy to start that conversation as this plan was adopted. It would have been much preferable to have that conversation been earlier. Also, it was starting just as COVID was starting, so conversations became tricky to have, and as we learned the whole Zoom platform and how to have those conversations. But since then, our city manager has taken on an initiative where he's looking at all city services, including environmental sustainability, through social justice lens. And he's really working to have workshops, have conversations about social equity in all elements of public service throughout the city. So I've been involved in a lot of those conversations as they relate to climate justice and sustainability.
And I can talk a little bit about our planning process to engage Black and Brown communities. Similar to what Linda said, it was very difficult during our planning process to have as deep of engagement as we would have liked to with those communities, because the pandemic had just started right as we were beginning and launching our planning process. And I think some of our Black and Brown communities already had a lot of engagement fatigue, because there's a lot of planning going on different topics, especially housing in our community. But we know the importance of doing that, and we wanted to make sure we involved everybody as early as we could in the process. And of course, Zoom meetings made it really difficult for everybody to adequately access what we were doing. One of the things we realized early on because of the pandemic challenges was that we may not be able to get kind of individuals participating in our process, like them self-selecting and being able to access our process. We got out as much information as we could to neighborhoods and worked to kind of reach out to organizations that serve our vulnerable communities and engage them first and foremost, and to the extent that they could help sort of channel our work to neighborhood groups and individual. We're really pushing for that. We acknowledged during the planning process that given all of those challenges, that engagement would need to be an ongoing, continuous thing. So not only during the plan, but after as well. I think a lot of the strategies that we put in our plan aren't, groundbreaking. These are, actions and strategies that we've been talking about through our different planning processes for a very, very long time. And so where it really becomes important is making sure you're engaging communities around the implementation of those things that we have been talking about for a long time. So the way you might implement, transportation improvements, including, maybe better bike ped access for jobs access purposes in one community might be very different in another community. And so just being very sensitive and having those communities that are most impacted by climate help lead that conversation and identify the best ways to kind of put those projects in the ground. But again, it's always very important to get those communities in on the process from the very beginning and have them help even kind of develop the process if at all possible. We were just very challenged by that, which is very unfortunate. But I think we had some success in working with some of our committees that are focused on equity, helping to guide and almost audit our process to make sure we were being inclusive as we possibly could at that time.
Well, thanks, Karen. And it's hard to believe that our time is already up. I think we could have talked for another hour. It was really great to hear from all of you. Thank you, Mike, Linda, and Karen. And appreciate your time today. I think we learned a lot. And I'm sorry for all of the other individuals who had many more questions that we just simply couldn't get to, which I think is a great thing. Clearly, you are all interested in this, and we hope that you will remain engaged throughout this process that NOACA is about to undertake. So thank you to the panelists, and back to you, Joe.
Thank you very much to John Mitterholzer, Karen Clausen, Linda Arbogast, and Mike Foley for an outstanding discussion. We sincerely appreciate your support of NOACA's effort. We would like to take this opportunity to pose a second question to summit attendees to better understand climate action engagement. Remember, for those of you on YouTube, please visit NOACA's MindMixer platform, NOACA Live, to participate in these questions. Okay, our second question, how likely are you to engage with NOACA on the Regional Climate Action Plan? I'll give you a few seconds to make your selection, and then we'll talk about the results of our online poll. Okay, it looks like we're slowing down, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Just a few more coming in. Okay, so the majority of folks are interested. Majority of the respondents are interested in engaging. Some of you are already engaged. Nobody is not interested. So by your presence here, that makes sense that everyone who responded and who's at the summit wants to at least consider the opportunity. And I'm glad that the majority of you are interested in working with us on this process. Thank you for taking our second poll question. Now, here's a special message from U.S. Representative Marcy Kaptur.
I'm honored to join NOACA today for its Climate Action Summit. Please let me thank the Cleveland Foundation and George Gund Foundation for partnering in this important conversation. Special plaudits to our region's real friend, Grace Gallucci, NOACA's steadfast leader for everything you do for Northeast Ohio. You have been such an effective partner as we think boldly about what our future can be. A few weeks ago, I hosted an initial discussion with local stakeholders from across Ohio to talk about how we can work together to take advantage of the billions of dollars in new funding being made available from the Jobs and Infrastructure Bill. I'm proud to have fought alongside my colleagues to pass this historic bill. The Jobs and Infrastructure Bill will invest billions of dollars directly for jobs and infrastructure, including for roads and bridges, clean energy technology, multimodal transportation, coastal resiliency, and so much more. America needs smart strategies to tackle climate change and conserve our precious environmental wonders like Lake Erie and our Great Lakes, the largest body of fresh water on Earth. As chair of the House Energy and Water Appropriations Committee, I helped pass legislation directing the federal government's investment of tens of billions of dollars every year in our nation's energy and water needs. These resources are vital to our collective mission to sustain life on Earth. Right now in Congress, we are working to pass the annual federal bills that support the Department of Energy's critical advances in energy efficiency, weatherization, and next-generation renewables. Every day, the Department of Energy is guiding America's efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emission, spur our nation's economic competitiveness, and protect public health and safety. As a region, we need to think about how we can make progress right here at home. We must lift up our people and communities. Ohio has always been a national and global energy hub. Now, with breakthrough technologies like solar, hydrogen, thermal heat exchange, and biogas, we can build on our heritage and create new momentum. I want to thank Grace Gallucci, NOACA, the Cleveland Foundation, and the George Gund Foundation for bringing us here today, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you Let us invest in our region to move forward for a better, brighter, and healthier future. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for your motivational message, Representative Kaptur. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome our second panel of the summit to discuss how to achieve success through regional partnership. There'll be a brief period at the end for the panel to entertain questions from the audience. Please type your question at any time through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. NOACA staff will consider all questions as time permits. The moderator for this panel is Stephen Love, Program Director for Environmental Initiatives at the Cleveland Foundation. Director Love, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Grace, and good morning, everyone. As Grace mentioned, my name is Stephen Love, and I'm the Program Director for Environment at the Cleveland Foundation. We're really excited for today's conversation. And today we're going to talk about why regional approach is needed when we think about collaboration on climate and climate action. We know that we need collaborative approaches across sectors because we understand that as a region, we're only going to be able to work together if we think about this work at the collective level. There's also tremendous challenges ahead of us, but also tremendous opportunities if we can work together and align partnerships. We know that climate change has disproportionate impacts, particularly on low-income communities and communities of color. So as we do work together to address climate and to make the transition to a cleaner energy future, how do we embed across this work an understanding of equity across the region? So joining me this morning, we have Dr. Gavin Svensson, who's the Director of Research Collections and Curator of Invertebrate Zoology at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. Dr. Svensson oversees a large and diverse staff of scientists and conservation specialists there. Also joining me is Samia Bray, who is the Strategic Business Consultant and Thought Leader in the region, and a passion for cross-sector knowledge and leadership, and working to facilitate conversations that engage leaders in innovative thinking for nearly 30 years. We finally have Michael Peters, who's the CEO and co-founder of Sway Mobility, which mixes a background in public policy, investment, banking, sustainability, with a focus on transitioning to an electric future, complete with electric vehicles and shared mobility programs. And currently he is the CEO, but also co-founder of Sway Mobility. So let's get started with our panelists. We'll start with Dr. Svensson. What do you see as perhaps the biggest threats that climate change poses to our region in the years ahead?
Well, I think, we're coming from a natural history museum. We always think about the natural environment, both historically and in the now and in the future. And I think that climate change is one of the factors, only one of the factors in what we're seeing in large scale ecological changes within our region. We're seeing those changes with species distributions, with forest cover, with invasive species as well. And we're also seeing that there's an intense need for people to connect with the natural world because we're a part of a bigger ecological system. So it's really necessary for the community to think about this environmental change in a holistic framework and think about it as to what their impact on that world is and what that impact on the ecosystem, because it all feeds directly back onto us. Humans are a part of the greater system, right? So our actions feed back on us through the air we breathe, the food we eat, and the water that we drink. And any destabilization of an environmental system is a destabilization on what we have grown to rely on and take for granted, really, as a stable ecosystem, both in where we're able to source our food and the ecosystem that we're able to enjoy.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I know that, again, we see the impacts already taking place today, but we know that they're going to be exponentially worse into the future. Curious, Gavin, as you're thinking about taking action, what might be the opportunities for our region in a scenario where we do take action on climate?
Well, I think we really need to address people's understanding of the science of it and understanding of thinking about this critically. The museum just last year did a national Marist poll, and 90% think an understanding of science is necessary to them. And 92% of respondents believe that health of the environment directly impacts their own health. You know, these are pretty astounding numbers that we got back from that. And we also tested on what people think about their trust in science. And we found that 88% of respondents trust in science, but 85% want to learn even more about it. But only 44% feel like they're like, well, I guess 44% feel like they're falling behind. So this tells us at the museum that people's understanding of how the relevant framework influences their daily lives is critically important. But the amount of scientific information coming at people about their health, especially in a pandemic period of time, about changing environment, about what our lake ecosystem means to us, it's too much information, but they want to learn more. So I think a part of an action plan is really looking at like people's relevant connection to what this plan looks like, because it's going to take a broader community of engagement to implement the plan. People need to be on board with this, and people look at a lot of the facts coming at them and they don't see a direct connection with their daily lives. So measuring people's engagement with an action plan and making a lot of these big, broad issues connect with what is really relevant to them is going to be an important part of this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'd like to pull in Michael to this next question as well. And certainly Gavin will weigh in. So when we do think, say, NOACA as a regional partner to support the development of a climate plan, you started to allude to that, Gavin, in terms of what you might see as sort of the core elements to drive it. Maybe get some input from Michael. What would you see as kind of the core elements that you think should shape a regional climate plan?
Yeah, I think it's great that, frankly, we're thinking about it. And, I think a lot of the work that NOACA has already done has really laid the foundation for this, right? I mean, everything from thinking about how we better use the roadways we have by putting in protected bike lanes and, making them more suitable for multimodal travel, to thinking, very innovatively about how mobility is going to change in the future. And, from our perspective, thinking about how we make the mobility systems in the region work for everyone, right? So for us, it's really thinking about how we make sure that spectrum of mobility choices, which includes public transit at one end and bikes and scooters at the other, also includes cars, just because we've designed our cities for that. Now, we'd love to see less cars, but that need is not going to go away anytime soon.
Gavin, again, you alluded to this a little bit. What do you think might be some priorities to incorporate into a regional plan?
Well, I'll bring in something sort of on the fringe. I'm a big proponent of biomimicry. I think we can learn a lot from nature. I'm an entomologist. I learn a lot from insect biodiversity and how insects function in the world. I mean, in the most successful lineage on planet Earth of all time. And they've survived through a lot of stuff. And I think that what we can learn from how they structure their systems, how they efficiently use resources. And biomimicry is one of those things that could be turned to in terms of efficiency gains. I hear things like earlier in this summit about reducing congestion, getting people more efficient places, using less resources to deliver a lot of the needs that we have. And I think, evolution is 500 million years of experimentation, and there's a lot that we can learn from that. So those kinds of aspects are a really important component of this whole plan to me. And I think the scientific community, including NASA Glenn Research Station, Great Lakes Biomimicry, the Natural History Museum, a lot of the universities that we have are power players in this area, especially University of Akron. So I think there's a lot to learn, and I think bringing that scientific component to it would improve the climate action plan greatly.
So you're talking about the idea of putting kind of a biomimetic, I don't know if that's the right word, biomimicry lens to the plan. Michael, I know you also mentioned then, yeah, we're going to have to talk about mode shift, but we also have to recognize that part of our future is still going to be maintaining transportation infrastructure for vehicles. I guess we'll start with you, Michael. Are there specific targets or benchmarks that you think a plan should incorporate, a long-range plan on climate should incorporate?
Yeah, I think one of the ways that I think about it is, I think, 20, 30, 40 years ago, right, no one would have thought that Copenhagen or Stockholm would be like the biking cities that they are today, just due to the weather. And I think a lot of those same types of ideas persist in our region, right? You can't bike here all year round. And I think, there are a lot of ways to demonstrate that, we don't have to get in a private vehicle every time we walk outside of our door. So how do we start to measure that? I mean, certainly, a lot of the things, again, that we've started to do by measuring, how many miles of protected bike lane do we have? How much of our population has easy access to public transportation by being a quarter or a half mile within a bus or a train stop? So I think, increasingly, looking at things like that and making people aware of the benefits and resources and programs that are available to them today is the start. But then working with the community to figure out how we need to adjust and evolve that over time is really critical. To me, obviously I spend most of my time thinking about shared mobility. So thinking about, all the different resources that are available, whether it's scooters and bikes or cars or, whatever it may be, but also making sure that that is really spread out among, the 5-county region, right? It's great to have it in Ohio City, but we need it in Oberlin, right? We need it in Chardon and places like that. So how do we start to adapt these systems and think about the metrics being different, perhaps in those different places, but making sure that, the equitable distribution of access to mobility is throughout the region, I think is critical.
Yeah, so you were thinking along the lines of, I think that, again, the transportation benchmarks as part of any incorporated plan. And then also, I think the equity implications of that. What about emissions? What about greenhouse gas emissions, Gavin? How do we think about emissions impact as benchmarks? How do we also think about adaptation possibly as part of a benchmark or target from your lens?
Yeah, I think, I'm going to keep flying the environmental flag in this. I know we've been talking about transportation, but, metrics that I'd look towards is land preservation due to its carbon sequestration, how that relates to our carbon emissions over the broader spectrum of transportation and industry within the area, but also what water quality looks like and what carbon sequestration looks like across freshwater ecosystems. These are really fragile environments that we have in this region. A lot of them are going to be canaries in the coal mine as to what that looks like. And when we have land preservation and we can rely on land preservation for that carbon sequestration, it only goes so far when the whole dynamic changes. When you get invasive species, like in bark beetles that might be moving north because the conditions become warmer and start killing off our trees. That whole model starts to change. So biodiversity itself becomes a proxy for how well we're doing in this action plan, because biodiversity. I'll throw out one stat. Insects alone, and at the time this study was released, provide $57 billion a year in ecosystem services. Marking inflation, that's $80 billion a year nowadays. And what people ask is what is environmental services from insects? Well, it's pollination, it's waste management, it's all of these things that have such an important role in maintaining the environment as we know it. You start shifting away from that and you start having dynamic changes away from that, and we start changing the model of what freshwater looks like and what climate looks like in the region. So I would look for a lot of environmental proxies as they relate to emissions numbers that we're tracking.
So I guess my question then, as a follow-on to that, is we're talking about, again, sort of benchmarks for progress, I guess my question would be, how do we know if we're maybe not on target, or what do we think are maybe some of the challenges that we might encounter along the way towards hopefully a more climate resilient future for the region? And I could open that up to Michael and Gavin.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because, we've talked a lot in the last panel just about funding and having the funding available. So, that's kind of the blanket challenge that we always face. But I think that, as we think about, and sorry, I am, a little bit more singularly focused on the transportation aspects, but, to me, walkability is a really big component of that. And so if we want people to, use different modes, if we want to promote active transportation and things like that, we certainly need walkable communities. But with that, we have to think about not only how our transportation network is engineered and thinking about mobility hubs and other ways to make transportation and mode shift easier, but also things like tree canopy, right? Because if we have, if we think about the urban heat island effect and making it miserable to walk down the street, who's going to want to do that? So I think we do have these far-reaching, metrics that we can look at that include things along those lines. But to me, ensuring that we are engineering the system and collaborating with all the other partners and planning and everything else to make places more walkable is really critical.
I think we need to really engage the community consistently through this process. Like a measure of success, it's so hard to track it through a single metric, right? Or a group of metrics. And what we're talking about is, whether people are utilizing a particular service or system, or whether we're gaining biodiversity back, or whether we're preserving more acres, or whether we're protecting more fresh water. It's really about all the day-to-day choices so many millions of people are making across this broader NOACA region that we're talking about. And that's where they're buying their food. How do they have access to that food? What does transportation look like to get there and do that? Where are their jobs located? All of these things are these kinds of information that are a little bit more nuanced compared to these big metrics that we would look at. So I would look at success if we continue to have these conversations and we see broader engagement and understanding, and as well as public engagement and care across, what our community looks like, because it's going to take urban, suburban, and rural buy-in and investment to make this action plan implemented. It's about the implementation of this strategy that's really going to be the thing that sets us apart.
I would echo everything you both just indicated or laid out. I'll do my best in a moment here to try to channel Samia Bray, who I think may have encountered some difficulties in being able to join our conversation, and just saying that, when we think about the long range impacts here, how do we incorporate, frankly, equity to ensure that it's undergirded in all of the work? We know that the clean energy transition is coming. But we know that if we aren't intentional about how that transition takes place, we know that communities that have historically been left behind, communities of color, rural communities as well, low-income communities, will be left behind. And so how do we be intentional then from the beginning, and then as well hold ourselves accountable in that benchmarking and those progress indicators, to ensure that equity is embedded, just as it is throughout NOACA's long-range transportation plan, ensure that it's embedded in the climate planning work as well. And it looks like we have a pretty lively dialogue starting to kick off on the Q&A. So maybe I can see if we can transition a little bit over here to our Q&A and get some thoughts from both of you on that. So I just want to first, address the question around, communities of color and engagement. I think we're not going to be successful if we don't, from the very beginning, think about this plan from the vantage point of how are the communities that have historically not been connected to regional assets or not been part of the conversation, how do those communities actually shape and lead the solutions? and be part of the conversation and the process. So I would just add that and underscore that. Michael, Gavin, I don't know if you have additional perspective to add there.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, initiatives like the Paradox Prize and others that have, really thought about, how we deliver a lot of these services, across the 5 counties has been critical. I mean, for us, it was critical in, learning and different perspectives and thinking about, how people interact with transportation services. So continuing to encourage innovation and pilots through projects like that, I think has been super beneficial.
Yeah, I think that, thinking about the community as a whole, it's everybody. When we see these changes play out in the future, the groups that are going to be most impacted quickest are underserved communities. The museum's taken steps with Mandel Community Days to make free admission for everybody on Sundays from East Cleveland and Cleveland, as well as to really explore how we're reaching out to the community itself to share science. I always go back to the science thinking is such a critical component of this, and getting everybody involved and empowered behind that is going to be an important part. It's everybody. It's going to take everyone.
So I have an additional question coming in. There is a perception that Northeast Ohio is potentially a climate refuge, due to our climate, access to fresh water. But we know that climate change poses a threat to the entire region, and again, just 20% of residents believe we're prepared, currently for climate change. So how can we bridge this gap to better inform the public and policymakers of the threats and opportunities that the climate crisis poses as we develop this plan?
Well,
maybe we'll start with Gavin.
Yeah, I'd love to chime in here, because there's been this myth of this region, in the Great Lakes region, is going to be a refuge. It's going to be this really amazing place in the future, because I think that the natural tendency is to go, the climate debate and the extreme weathers becomes this coastal debate, and becomes what's going to happen to Florida, what's going to happen to rising sea levels. Well, if we're sitting with 20% of the world's surface fresh water, we don't really have a clear picture of what that's going to look like long term. Will we have aridification in this region? Will it become much wetter? Will the environment change significantly enough where it isn't an attractive environment 50 years from now? And I think we really need to bring the Midwest, the Great Lakes region, into the future modeling of what climate change is going to look like in North America, because I don't want us to rely on saying that this place is going to be the next greatest place to live over the next 100 years, because in all reality, it might not be. And we don't have a clear understanding of that. And I think that's because the Midwest really hasn't been thought of as like one of these front lines of climate change, but it's everywhere. This is impacting the entire planet in every corner, and everywhere is going to change. And we should recognize that ourselves in this region.
I appreciate you sharing that, Gavin. Again, I think that the narrative that prevails often is that we're going to be unscathed or least scathed, but even if we are somewhat less impacted, we are still very much impacted, and I think we're also going to be impacted by the reverberations of what's happening in other parts of the world and other parts of the country, and the ramifications for this region, then whether that's migration or economic shocks or other challenges. So climate aside, we're going to be impacted one way or the other. We have a question from by Cleveland, actually, that says, addressing climate will require, again, making difficult and perhaps unpopular decisions, but we know we don't have time for incremental action or change. So how do we position a regional climate plan to push and support leaders to truly invest in real infrastructure and pass policies to make the region more climate resilient? Maybe that's a question for Michael, for Gavin. I'm happy to weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the biggest things, is just, and maybe, and hopefully this is not true, but I sometimes get the sense that, there's a lot of things in our region where we are very risk averse, and we're very timid about trying new things, or making that that step to something else. And I think we need to get over that, right? I mean, there's no reason that we can't be a national leader in many of the different things that we're talking about and doing. And so part of that is a psychological one, part of it is a funding one. But if we are to take best advantage and deliver the best resources and services to our residents, I think that is one of the things that sometimes maybe doesn't hold us back, but it doesn't let us take the big steps that we sometimes need to take.
Stephen, I'll
Have
throw
anything
back
to add? Yeah. Well, again, I would argue that at the end of the day, this is going to require a major push and truly a fundamental shift in how we do business today. But we know that then that's going to require truly sustained action and alignment from both public, private and philanthropic sectors. And so I think the best way forward is to ensure that we maintain and build out and strengthen those networks and those partnerships at a local level, because we know that until we ultimately have the alignment at the local level, we're not going to be able to access the types of resources that are coming down the pike, whether that's state or federal, or frankly potentially have the alignment at the local policy or state funding decisions. So I think the key really here is to try to get as much alignment on priorities and align ultimately funding around that. And so really excited to see as this plan develops and as we have leadership at City Hall and soon next year at the county, that it will be hopefully part and partnership of shaping this direction. Just want to make sure we note that Samia has joined our conversation. Samia, good to see you this morning. Better late than never. I know we're running, I'm not sure how much time we have left here for you, but I would love to get you into the conversation. And if Michael and Gavin don't mind, maybe I can just give you the floor for just a few minutes, and would love for you to just kind of think about, what do you see as kind of the imperative here for NOACA to move forward with a long-range climate plan, and what do you see as maybe the key or core elements of that plan as NOACA moves forward that we should be keeping in mind?
Sure. Well, thank you. And I apologize. Technology works until it doesn't. So here we
We've
are.
all been there now, right?
We are here together. So I won't spend any time on that. I'll just say that I think that, one of the things that is really, really important, and kudos to NOACA for already moving in this direction, and that is making sure that there is a strong equity element, us with some legacy conditions, right? Disproportionate impact on communities, redlining, these types of things. As we move forward, and as NOACA looks at its climate action moving forward, the work that has already been done about the contractor, I had a chance to look at some of your documentation and some of your policies that you put in place in 2020. The contractor engagement, the MBE contractor engagement, the community feedback, these types of things I think are very important, especially as we look at equity, because as this climate emergency continues to move forward, the more equity that we can build into policy and practice in key organizations like NOACA, the more likely we're to see it happen in reality all across municipalities within the transportation space throughout this entire region. And so as a leader in that space, I am encouraged. I am excited to see equity. I'm excited to see waste reduction policies and procedures. And I'm even more excited to see more accountability and transparency come forward through this work together. And thank you, Stephen, for that moment.
Thank you, Samia. I tried to channel your message a little bit earlier, but it's much more effective coming from you. I guess I would just ask as maybe a follow-on to that. I'd ask Gavin and Michael, what do you see as maybe the challenges to implementing or to putting forward a climate plan? What do you see as maybe the challenges around the integration of equity or embedding of equity into this work? And what happens if we don't get it right?
Yeah, sure. So the challenges that, as I see them, is being comfortable with the status quo, and also seeing people more as data points. Like, all of our days are busy, and sometimes as we're doing our work, we can unknowingly, not purposely, intent really isn't the point right here, because I believe the intent is perhaps good, but I think it's possible to fall into a place where people and policy become data points and check boxes to make sure that we do all the things that we're supposed to do. One of my contributions and gifts to this world is helping people stop living their lives by accident and live them on purpose. And I just strive to say, if we're doing anything from an equity perspective, if we're doing it because we have to, we're doing it because it's a checkbox, if we're motivated by anything other than seeing humanity and all people deserve clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and soil that will not poison us, that then can be a distraction that makes us see people as data points and not as additional shades of humanity. And it is in that place that we make decisions that in hindsight, we look back and we say, wow, I could have done that a different way. And so I see that as both a challenge and an opportunity, because that's something that we can change. It's about how we approach something. Do we approach it as a zero sum? If I lose, then you win. If you win, then I lose. Or do we approach it as it's a place where we have an opportunity in this unprecedented time with resources like we've never seen before coming throughout this entire country, bipartisan dollars coming into this region. Do we use this opportunity for those who have been disproportionately impacted to support, to listen, to provide the resources? That means it may go a little slower in some cases than what we've accustomed to. Or the danger is we blow past it in some ways like we've all inherited. And in that place, we continue 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, having the same conversation that we're having right now. The same communities, the same individuals continue to get disproportionate impact in multiple ways over multiple systems consistently. And it's my hope that this conversation will inspire us to take this moment to not do that again. It's in our hands to not do that again.
Well, again, Samia, I thank you for laying that out. And I think, between your comments and some of our discussion earlier in the panel, I think we've made it, I think, hopefully clear that we have to embed equity. But I guess the question is how or perhaps what does that look like? And so I'm curious, starting with you, but I would love to hear from Michael and Gavin as well to chime in here. How do you see this plan inclusively engaging low-income communities, communities of color, and communities that have historically, again, been left out of the process, the planning process, or frankly, left out of the economic transitions that have taken place in this region? And we know that the clean energy transition is another economic transition that's going to be coming. So how do we do this in an inclusive and equitable way from the beginning?
Sure. So there are some.
Maybe we'll start with Gavin.
Oh, okay. I'll just echo. No, I'll echo what Samia what I think she was getting at. I think she's right on target with this stuff. We got to meet people where they're at, right? It's very easy when we're thinking about a climate action plan is what institutional alignment looks like, what certain initiatives look like. But it's really easy, if you think about it in that context, that we're not actually meeting people where they're at. We don't know what communities really, really need, and we're going to miss stuff. And if we miss stuff like that, they're going to become disinterested in the whole process, because we're not addressing the core needs of what a lot of our community actually is focused on, and what their needs are. So I think the conversation needs to be meet the communities where they're at, understand what their needs are, and build an incorporation mechanism into what this institutional alignment looks like, and what our initiatives will look like over the next decades for this Climate Action Summit or Climate Action Plan.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think this is really an opportunity to do some significant capacity building, right? I think, the way that we approach this, the funding that will come from it and other initiatives, we need to build our own capacity here, right? We can't keep bringing it in from other places. And we don't have to, right? But us as an example, right? We were able to develop, our electric vehicle car share programs because we had the backing of the city of Oberlin, because we had the Paradox Prize, right? Because we were able to do pilots around those things. And now that's extended our work to Detroit and Columbus and soon to Indiana, right? Because we're the only one in the Midwest kind of working on these things. Well, we need more opportunities to do more of that type of work that generates, and starts in Cleveland and then can spread from there. So to me, using it as a tool for capacity building is really key.
Yeah, I agree. Those are really amazing insights. I'd also align with those comments and say that Cleveland, in this region, we have a wealth of leveraging existing data sets, right? We have maps that can tell us where the redlining happened and where this happened and where the air quality is, and we have all of these resources. So one of the things that I would really encourage is looking at other community action plans that have been done recently. We have the Cleveland one, we have the Cuyahoga County one. There's different municipalities that are doing them. There's Ohio Power Clean Future Ohio. There's lots of resources that are available that give us that data, so that it's not a complete start over. We understand that NOACA brings this unique perspective to all of that data, but it could be contextualized through the NOACA lens. So that's one area. The other one is I constantly hear in my lived experience, but I don't know them, right? So there's this reticence, or this, I'm not gonna call it fear. I'm gonna say this concern about, well, if I don't know them, how can I trust them? And I'm gonna say them in air quotes, right? So we don't know who the they is because we don't know them. And so there's a hesitancy. I know who I know, and I'm comfortable with who I know to some extent. That's a human nature thing. That's not any particular organization thing. And so there's that uncomfortableness of, is there something that someone else may bring to the table that I don't know about? There are organizations out here that have been doing things that could be of value for decades. They just haven't been resourced, to Michael's first, I think it was Michael who said that, the capacity building. And so when you see innovative projects, I think, Stephen, you can speak to this. When you see innovative projects like the Black Futures Fund, or the Ohio Climate Justice Fund, or others like that, when you see this, you start to see the wealth of resource that really is in our region that we haven't tapped into. Now, having said that, there's balance, right? When people are dealing with disproportionate impact, their everyday life is filled with all kinds of challenges. And so to be invited to a conversation to say, tell me about your issue, and then that issue doesn't change, there's a fatigue that comes with that. And so, those are things to consider and take into consideration. And based on some of the things that I've read in the policies that have been put in place so far with NOACA, I get a sense that those things are being looked at, being considered. And then the last thing that I'd share in this regard is here at Bell, Black Environmental Leaders Association, where I serve as co-director alongside David Wilson and in the legacy of Jacqueline Gillen, we operate in what we call a distributed leadership model. And that is, we build trust in the leader who is the resource, who best prepared in that moment for the issue that we're facing. And so in that regard, it is a little unorthodox. I'm not saying that NOACA needs to change to that, but perhaps a little bit of that within the existing organization could be helpful, because you'll be amazed at sometimes within our own house, the resources that we have that we might not be aware of because we haven't necessarily looked through that lens.
Thank you for sharing that, Samia. And I think you hit the nail on the head there multiple times, and recognize that this is going to require kind of a different approach than perhaps we've taken in the past, and can be a messy process. But we know that in order to truly have an inclusive process that identifies capacities and partners within our own community that we perhaps have not brought to a more visible place, it's going to look that way. So I appreciate you sharing that, and as well to Michael and Gavin for their comments. I know we're coming to a close here. 10-20 second closing from each of you as to how we make this successful from a planning perspective. We'll start with Gavin.
Yeah, I think the broader perspective, I think, is necessary. People's role in the environmental framework, how they impact that framework, and how that comes back and impacts them is going to be, that's what I always turn back to, is that we're not separate from the world around us. We're deeply inherently a part of it. Even if we live in a rural environment or an urban environment, these things all matter. And I think when we have those types of connected conversations and people are connected with the natural world, there's a much deeper relevance to what all this means to them, their future and their children's future and their children's children's future. I think that's how it comes home to people.
Michael?
Yeah, I would just say, I think building off the momentum of the Sustainable Cleveland Summit, right, which brought together lots of people with lots of interesting ideas, maybe didn't always have a concrete, result, but, really, I think was great at bringing a really wide range of stakeholders together. And so I'd love to see something at that scale.
Finally, Samia, last word.
I know you won't believe this, Stephen, but it will be short and sweet. The plan that works is the plan that works, right? So we have the pieces, we have the wisdom, we have the knowledge, we have the resources. Now I inspire action. The plan that works is the one that works. Choose the one that is best based on the information that you have available to you, and then implement it to the best of your capacity and ability. Along the way, make adjustments, of course. That is how you ensure success. Making a plan, working that plan, and then holding each other accountable to getting there together.
Words that will hopefully reverberate as this process moves forward. Thank you, Samia. And thank you again to Michael Peters and Dr. Gavin Svensson for your time this morning. And thank you for NOACA for hosting and for giving me this stage as well this morning. So I'm going to turn it back now to Joe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen Love, and thank you also very much to Samia Bray, Gavin Svensson, and Michael Peters for an enlightening and heartening discussion. We sincerely appreciate your support of NOACA's effort. We would like to take this opportunity now to pose a final question to Summit attendees, a third question of the day, to better understand the importance of a climate action plan. And again, for those of you following us on YouTube, you may visit NOACA's MindMixer platform, NOACA Live, to participate in the polling. So our third question, how critical do you think a climate plan is for Northeast Ohio? And I'll give you a bit of time to respond. And we're getting the last few responses trickling in. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, share the results. And this is very heartwarming to see. Almost all of you feel that it is at least important, if not the highest priority for our region. And we agree. So it's great to feel this level of support. And I'm very excited to partner with all stakeholders in our region as we continue forward with this effort. Thank you very much for taking our third poll question. And now we have a special message from U.S. Representative David Joyce.
Hello, everyone. Congressman Dave Joyce here. As someone who grew up on the shores of Lake Erie, I care deeply about our environment, and I know many of you feel the same. I agree that combating climate change shouldn't be just a national priority, but a global priority, one that the United States must continue to lead on. Since 1990, America has reduced its carbon emissions more than the next 12 emissions-reducing countries combined. In fact, over the last 10 years, we've achieved the largest reduction of emissions in the history of conventional energy. That was accomplished while, on average, lowering energy costs for American households and utilizing an all-of-the-above energy strategy. I'm proud to report that Ohio's oil and natural gas industry has been leading on clean, safe, and reliable energy production for years. Between 2005 and 2015, Ohio's power sector had the biggest carbon emissions reductions of any state in the country. I'm equally proud to have worked alongside Senator Brown to obtain a federal grant that helped bring innovative zero-emissions electric buses to Ohio this past year. Those of us in Congress should be working together to enact policies that reduce global emissions, not America's economy, cut energy prices, not energy choices, and export American innovation, not American jobs. The reality is that drastic environmental protection measures that kill American jobs and hike up energy prices will end up having a negative impact on the future sustainability of our planet if global emissions continue to rise because of foreign powers like China and Russia. As emerging nations develop and their energy needs increase, it's imperative that the United States bring them the cleanest energy in the world instead of letting them become reliant on our adversaries for dirtier, more carbon-intensive resources. Thankfully, American innovation can advance our efforts to mitigate climate change, build up our resiliency, and help us deliver greater global emissions reductions at substantially lower energy prices. Ohioans have always been strong stewards of our natural resources. We know that we can be good stewards of the environment without sacrificing jobs or hurting our economy. I can assure you that I remain committed to achieving bipartisan progress on the climate policies that ensure the United States can continue to be the global leader in reducing emissions and provide cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable energy here at home and abroad. With that, I want to thank you for your time and wish you the best as you continue with NOACA's Climate Action Summit. It's an honor to represent you here in our nation's capital. God bless and stay well.
Thank you very much for your poignant message, Representative Joyce. Now I'd like to welcome Tony Richardson of the Gun Foundation back to the stage to discuss our call to action and next steps. So that's what we will do to wrap up the session today. So Tony, I'd like to ask you, what specific climate-related priorities or program areas are there for the Gun Foundation? What are you working on? And how can the development of a regional climate action plan support your efforts?
Thanks, Grace. So I'll start with the second part of the question. I think at a very high level, I think a regional plan can help us bring our efforts to scale. And so when you think about our particular work around climate and environmental justice, I'll speak a little bit about sort of the broader strategy, then I'll talk specifically about some of the priorities or projects that we've supported here in the region and nationally for that matter. So we really try to focus on supporting organizations led by people of color and that serve communities of color, as well as those who have been historically underrepresented or those who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. We support organizations that develop and advocate for public policy on climate change and to advance clean energy, transportation, water, and air. And then lastly, we have a huge focus around mitigating climate by promoting sustainable land use, creation of accessible green spaces in Cleveland, environmental justice, and at the highest level, we really just try to focus on and aim for people to live in a safe and healthy environment. And so I'm going to switch gears here and speak specifically about a few initiatives that we've supported here. So starting in 2008, the Gun Foundation supported the City of Cleveland's most recent Climate Action Plan update. And I think one of our staff members here served on the advisory committee, might have been John Minnehoser, if I'm not mistaken. And the foundation also supported Cleveland's Clean and Equitable Energy Future Report. And that report creates a pathway for Cleveland to equitably transition to 100% clean energy. The foundation has also supported Sustainable Cuyahoga County Toolkit, which was noted earlier on one of the sessions here. We also support Power Clean Future Ohio, which is helping cities reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by at least 30% by 2030. And cities that have committed to this goal in our region include Shaker Heights, Cleveland Heights, Euclid, Lakewood, and Cleveland. We also support at a policy level, Greater Ohio Policy Center, Bike Cleveland, Clean Fuels Ohio, that's focusing on rapid adoption of EVs, Environmental Health Watch, Healthy Homes Initiative, as well as the Black environmental leaders in their statewide efforts to advocate and create a comprehensive clean energy legislation that's rooted in equity, economic development, transparency, and accountability. So that's a lot, I know, but that's only really, scratching the surface of gun supportive work in this particular area.
Great, thank you. NOACA's development of a climate action plan is really an outgrowth of its ENEO 2050 plan, which was the region's long-range plan developed last year, actually over 18 months and just adopted by the board last year. It's also important and intended to implement the long-range plan. The long-range plan does call for some very strong measures in order to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. And we need to have this plan to get us to 2050. And we need to do it in a way that the community has built consensus around. And when we talk about consensus, we'll be managing the development of the plan, but we need to involve the whole region. What's your perspective on regional engagement and why it's important? I know we talked about that a little bit earlier, and specifically Ron Richard had mentioned the engagement by many sectors, including the business community and the legislators. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so to plus one that point that Ron made earlier, I think, and as most of us here probably would agree that long gone are the days where our success and future prospects are tied to our municipal boundaries. And we have to continue thinking regionally, right? Because on the global stage, our competitiveness is tied to our region, not our individual neighborhoods, cities, or counties. And I also think it's important that when we go along implementing this work, that we be mindful of how we've transitioned around or how we've organized around certain issues as a community, as a region, as a country, and that we are really addressing racial equity and poverty. It's my belief that we can't advance any regional strategy without placing racial equity at the center. And so how do we not leave people behind? How do we engage people in an authentic and thoughtful way, and in a way that is in a way in which they want to be engaged, right? And so I do think that NOACA, obviously, with your footprint, your audience, and what you all represent under your leadership, Grace, I think you all are prime and poised to be a hub that can really bring people together around climate action.
Thank you. I appreciate those thoughts. As many of the region's entities, whether they be cities or counties, have begun to develop those plans, and in some cases, as you mentioned, you've already supported their development. How about in terms of execution? So you've done a lot to develop these plans. Tell us a little bit about how the foundations, the Cleveland Foundation, the Gunn Foundation, and NOACA can best support the actual implementation of those plans.
Well, I think at one, like convenings, right, and then working with the different entities around identifying shared goals and sort of metrics, performance metrics that are tied to outcomes, right, and then sort of checking in and holding ourselves accountable to what we say is important to us as communities or as a larger region and community. So I think that's the biggest role that NOACA and foundations can play. And I think because we are nonpartisan, apolitical, we can be a space where we can essentially hold each other accountable, right, without it being tied to partisanship. And then from philanthropy standpoint, as I mentioned and alluded to earlier, we can obviously fund everything from equitable climate and clean energy transition plans, decarbonized grid planning and implementation. We can co-invest, we can provide, low interest rate PRIs, and then also leverage our investment portfolio to finance CDCs and CDIFs. And so we can be creative around financing. And as we know, some of our municipalities and counties and entities in general may be strapped for resources to execute on some of these things. So I think this is where philanthropy comes in, and we can be very creative around what that support can look like. And as was pointed out earlier, we talked about our region having many rural pockets. And I think philanthropy can also support climate change and climate focused agriculture as well. So I think we have the different pieces, we have the various entities and leadership. It's just sort of the accountability, right? Bringing us together and us going back to cross check and reference what we said we were going to do and just actually do it, right? I think we're beyond the conversations. It's time to implement.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So here we are towards the end of today's summit, and we've got a call to action. What I'm going to ask the audience to do is in the Q&A or the chat, wherever the questions we're going into, rather than questions, put in what you think a call to action is. What's a call to action? What does that mean to you? And if staff, Joe, or so folks could just kind of highlight a couple of those things that come in. When I think of call to action, I think both personally as well as globally. So that means what can I do as an individual? And particularly when it comes to transportation sector, there's a lot. I can change the number of trips. I can change the type of trips. I can change modes. There's a number of things I can do with my particular travel habits and multiply that times the 2.1 million people we have in the NOACA region. So that's at that level. And that can make changes. We have in our long range plan, for example, a mode share shift of 5%. So taking single occupancy vehicles from about 94% to 89%. It doesn't sound like a lot, but that's going to be a huge change for folks, 5% of all the trips then to be shifted. How can we help? How can we make that happen? So that's at the personal level. Then when you get into the more global, and I don't mean worldwide at this point, I mean global as in just higher level, how do we do things? That's when you, I think we are really in need of partners. We do a good job communicating some of the needs and the call to action around transportation. What are the other sectors? We need help there. And even with transportation, how can we more globally, thinking about how the region interacts with business, government, et cetera, how can we change the paradigm around the everyday commute. You know, Beth mentioned talking about the congestion. You know, we've started during the pandemic doing telecommuting. Can we continue some telecommuting? Can we continue to do that to shift trips, et cetera? So, Joe, do you have anything from the chat or Q&A, a call to action? What do folks want to do, or what can they do, or what do they want us to do?
Grace, we do have some questions and some comments that people have posted. Barbara Clint has said, I want to work with partners throughout the city to get the Midway built as a region-wide protected bike scooter network, as this will be very helpful to achieving NOACA's mode shift goals. Grace, do you or Tony want to speak to the Midway project?
Actually, that's a great point. The Midway project is one of many capital projects that NOACA has invested in over the last decade to build physical infrastructure that will allow people to walk and bike more. So getting people to shift from the automobile to walking and biking, and to better integrate public transit. So that first pilot of the Midway, I believe, is essentially downtown to East 55th along Superior Avenue, and we are very excited about that. But as I said, many, many, many of the investments we have made and investments that we are planning for in the ENEO 2050 support not only drivers, but support walkers, bikers, and transit riders.
And Grace, I'll just add really quickly, that's a great project. And I think that speaks to one of my points around supporting insertion and sourcing on the front end, the research, right, to inform comprehensive, holistic and planning and implementation, right? So I think we can play in that sandbox as well. And I think something that is also important is like underwriting and convening folks to engage in peer-to-peer exchanges, right? So that we can encourage the cross-pollination of ideas and practices, not just here in the region, but like to your point, globally, right? So how do we share what we're learning and then learn from other communities to inform how we go about doing our work here?
Thank you both. Here's another comment and a question from Stephen Litt. How much jurisdiction does NOACA have over aspects of the economy and environment beyond transportation? And Grace, I think you'll agree with me that we are now understanding, and the federal government is understanding, that transportation has much more breadth than people probably originally thought.
Right. And I think when you think about comprehensive regional planning, even if you look at transportation takes into consideration economic development, it takes into consideration housing, it takes into consideration equity, it takes into consideration so many different things. And with the passage of the new IIJA, the federal government has been clear that metropolitan planning organizations like NOACA do have the ability to plan for some of those other more comprehensive planning areas in relationship to transportation. And I bring up specifically housing as it is referenced in the legislation. Housing is literally 1 out of every 2 trips start or end at home. Actually, all trips start and end at home. 1 out of 2, you start or end. But home to work, home to school, home to doctor's offices, home is important. So how we look at housing and how we look at land use is critical. And that's where some of the change comes in. And we've heard some of that from the panelists earlier, that land use, getting people to either live closer to where they work, or go to school, et cetera, or thinking about how to better position those trips to accommodate other aspects of that life. We have in our long-range plan very specific projects, programs, policies, and plans that deal with transit-oriented development. And that's really thinking about how to take current places that are on a transit line and expanding or enhancing that geographic area or the footprint to include housing or stronger housing and jobs as well. We have 6 major regional job hubs, as well as many sub-regional and legacy job hubs. How do we better connect those job hubs to people, but without having them commute an hour and a half? And it is a lot more than just a direct bus line or train line. That is certainly part of the solution. But again, thinking outside of the box, changing that dynamic. What does it look like to know that your personal carbon footprint makes a difference? And so how do you change that? And I suppose, Joe, that's probably the time for me to make the plug for GoHio Commute, where you can log your trips and you can see how your personal actions do play into the larger benefit for the region when it comes to clean air and the long-term carbon footprint.
Grace, not just plugging Ohio Commute, but NOACA continues to develop and roll out programs like our new VanFlow program that will feed directly back into Ohio Commute.
That's right. So anything else, Joe, there?
I think there's another question, and this is about another program on which NOACA has been expending a lot of effort and has made a commitment. This is about passenger rail. Sue Mancino, I will continue to advocate to bring passenger rail back to the entire greater Cleveland area and across Ohio, bringing people from across Ohio here and us to them. And I know that NOACA has focused more recently on our potential new role as a regional hub. And maybe, Grace, you want to speak a bit to that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sue, for that question. And I appreciate all of your advocacy for passenger rail. NOACA has been supportive of passenger rail, but we have taken a stronger position with Amtrak's unveiling of Cleveland as a mini hub. That gives us a tremendous opportunity to expand service out of the Cleveland area. And we also want to ensure that they keep the Cleveland to Chicago corridor intact and strong. We have currently put in place an alliance, and we are formalizing that alliance with the metropolitan planning organizations across the corridor from Cleveland to Chicago, and then ultimately looking at the fact that Cleveland is also midway point from Cleveland to the East Coast. And so keeping those ideas very strong, we have filled out an application for a service development plan for that corridor. And yes, we are working very hard behind the scenes in terms of advocacy, as well as in front of the scene to make sure that Cleveland is able to capitalize upon the additional dollars that are available for passenger rail. There's $66 billion in the IIJA for Amtrak, and we would like to ensure that Amtrak considers the corridor from Cleveland to Chicago and Cleveland to the East Coast just as important as the Northeast corridor. And to go into the reasons why would be longer than we have, but it is an absolute, it's a corridor, especially considering the long-term impacts of climate change and thinking about if the East Coast is not really the East Coast anymore, and we start to get a little bit of that either waterfront property ourselves, or we are simply reshaping what that looks like. Cleveland is here to stay, and Cleveland can connect many parts of the country better, particularly the Midwest to the East Coast. So we're very excited about that. And thank you, Sue, again, for all your work that you do in that area. So at this point, thank you, Tony, very much for your insightful comments. We really appreciate your participation in today's summit, as well as the Gun Foundation's support of initiatives, whether by various organizations or collectively. NOACA's Climate Action Plan will include 4 components that NOACA staff will develop in partnership with a consultant and numerous working groups and public advisory groups over the next 15 months. So now we're going to get down to business. The Climate Action Plan will have 4 major components. Those major components are, number 1, a regional greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Where are the greenhouse gas emissions coming from? A regional climate risk and vulnerability assessment. A set of climate mitigation strategies. A set of climate adaptation strategies. So those are the 4 major components. We'll complete the regional greenhouse gas emissions inventory and the climate risk and vulnerability assessment by September of 2022, which is this year. So we're talking about 6 months from now. NOACA will finalize the climate mitigation and adaptation strategies in the spring of next year. NOACA will present the final climate action plan to its board of directors for their review and approval in June of 2023. NOACA has invited numerous leaders in government, business, education, transportation, health, and advocacy from around the region to serve on a strategy committee for the Climate Action Plan. The strategy committee will help set goals and objectives for the plan and provide guidance on overall direction. Its first meeting will occur the last week of this month. NOACA has asked our strategy committee members to help identify a technical working group or technical working group members from each of their organizations or even outside of their organizations to support staff and consultant efforts to develop each of the 4 plan components and the final plan document itself. Its first meeting will be in April. Additional work streams and advisory groups will facilitate the development of specific content within the plan's components and provide critical feedback. And NOACA staff will identify and assemble those members and facilitate their engagement during the next 15 months. So that's the plan. And in conclusion, there are 2 ways that you can immediately participate in NOACA's Climate Action Plan effort. First, take the pledge to demonstrate your support for climate action planning in Northeast Ohio. To take the pledge, please go to NOACA Live, our new Mind Mixer platform. You may utilize the QR code or follow the link shown on your screen. And this is the same as it was earlier. Second, set up an account on NOACA Live to register and then share a thought about the Climate Action Plan. For example, what is one thing that you need to see in the final draft of the plan to make it successful? Mind Mixer helps NOACA staff engage with the public and also helps public stakeholders engage with one another. This is a place for you to collaborate with your peers and make your community a better place. Mind Mixer works with NOACA staff to host the site. The input you and your friends, family, and neighbors, your coworkers provide will be taken into account by NOACA in the development of the Climate Action Plan, as well as shared with local leaders. They will keep you posted on the impact your ideas and opinions make on your community in Northeast Ohio. This concludes NOACA's Climate Action Summit. I'd like to thank all of our speakers and our panelists who have made this program such a successful kickoff to NOACA's Climate Action Plan. Your support, expertise, and collaboration will catalyze our efforts to embrace a more sustainable future for Northeast Ohio. I would like to also thank our attendees for their attention and participation this morning. We look forward to collaborating with you through committees, working groups, and advisory groups to develop an effective, comprehensive, and forward-thinking plan. This was a terrific opportunity for us to introduce the plan widely and to essentially begin the execution of developing the plan. So from this day forward, we are no longer just working inside of NOACA. We are now broadening our work to be collective. And finally, I'd like to thank NOACA's Climate Action Team who developed and produced today's excellent summit. Joe McDonald and Katie Moore, along with the other members of their team. Thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon.